Welcome, Soundies, to our Sound for Video session today. It's the 15th of January, 2023. It's great to have you here. Hope you're all doing well out there. And let's jump on over to our agenda and talk about what we'll cover today. First up, Fairlight Mixing Fundamentals course, still in post-production, coming along nicely, definitely on track for February 1st. So again, if you're not signed up already at the school, you'll want to do that if you're interested in the course. It's free to sign up for the school. The course, of course, will have a price to it, but we'll have a coupon for those that are already members of the school. So if you're not already signed up, go to school.learnlightandsound.com. And if you do want to receive the coupon, you will need to make sure that you've opted into the email. We're pretty careful about how we use that email. We don't just send out random stuff all the time. We send out notifications when we're having a Sound for Video session, and when there's a new course, we'll send out one simple email. No hard sells, so there's not a lot of risk signing up for that list. Just wanted to underscore that. Next, a question that came up quite some time ago, and that we've kind of answered in small bits, is how do you make sense of the specifications for audio gear? So when you're looking at a microphone and you look at its specifications on the manufacturer's website, for example, how do you make sense of that? What do you look for? What do these things mean? And specifically today, we're going to take a look at one called impedance and what that means and what you need to know about that. We'll also take a slightly broader look at audio specifications overall and kind of highlight a couple of nuances that happen out there. All the manufacturers don't use the exact same specifications, so you can't always compare exactly, but we'll talk about a few of those things. And then when we're done with that, we'll come back to the chat for a question and answer session. So with that, we'll go ahead and start here. So first up, impedance is what we're talking about today. That's an electronics term. And the question is, what does it mean? And here's the technical definition. Hold on. If you don't understand any of this, hold on. Just stick with us here. It'll make sense in just a few minutes here. But impedance is the total opposition to the flow of alternating current in an electrical circuit. It's measured in ohms. Okay? So you might be asking yourself, what does that mean? And especially, what are the practical implications of that? Let's kind of dig in a little bit more and talk about what that means. So you will see the specifications for microphones in different ways, and sometimes it will be called output impedance. Usually on a microphone, it will be output impedance, but on a recorder or mixer or audio interface, it may be listed, or anything with a preamplifier, it will often be listed as input impedance or load impedance or termination impedance or terminating impedance. So we'll come back to that one in just a minute, but for microphones, typically, you will see output impedance. And this is a measure of how easily the power will flow from the output on that microphone, so through the XLR output. Okay, we have something, Danny.
What makes the current? What will make it not flow as easily? Like what actual?
Okay, Danny's jumping way ahead.
Oh, okay. If you're going to get to that, no problem.
We're not going to go into the. I'm not an electronics engineer, so we're not going to talk about all the details about microphone design and the components they use and what the different impedances. It's not as if one impedance is good and another one is bad necessarily. So we'll kind of it'll start to gel a little bit as we talk it. So output impedance is usually a specification you will see for microphones, and it is, in very basic terms, it's a measure of how easily the power will flow from that output, and it's measured in ohms. Okay, so just kind of stick with us here. What about input impedance? Again, also sometimes referred to as load impedance, terminating impedance, or termination impedance. It's a measure of how much power that input will draw, and this is what you see typically on a preamplifier, an audio interface, a field recorder. Anything with a microphone input is going to have some sort of input impedance measurement or specification. So that has to do with how much power that input will draw from the thing that you have plugged into it. So going back, on a microphone, it's output impedance, and that's a measure of how easily power will flow from that output. And then input impedance is a measure of how much power that input will draw. Okay, so just very high level terms. The question you may have is, so what does that mean in practical terms? Glad you asked. Let's take a look. Typically, historically, and we're talking specifically here about microphones to microphone inputs is what we're covering in very specific terms. We can talk about impedance in broader terms later on. But historically, most of the microphones and most of the preamplifier designs actually were designed for having matched impedance. So you would have the same output impedance from your microphone as you would to the input on your preamplifier. And usually that was around, 500 ohms or 600 ohms. Very commonly you'd see 600 ohms. So the microphone would output a 600 ohm impedance, and then the input would have a measure of a 600 ohm input impedance. So that's typically what happened historically. However, with modern designs, there's a slightly different design, and often, in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, and that is that they're often designed for bridging impedance. And what that means is that the input impedance should be generally about 10 times that of the output impedance of the microphone. So the input on your preamplifier, your mixer, your recorder, your audio interface should generally be about 10 times that of the output impedance of your microphone. So if you have a microphone with a 100 ohm output impedance, you would want your input on your recorder or mixer to have at least a 1000 ohm input impedance. And that's just for optimal performance of the microphone with that preamplifier. So that's all it really means. So here's the question. What happens if you don't do matched impedance or you don't have a bridging impedance? What happens to your signal? That's the question. And usually it won't destroy any microphones, but it may not sound optimal. I think what it can do is it can color the sound a little bit, or it can also it can reduce or change the levels, the expected levels of the output or of the microphone. So you may need some additional gain or maybe a little bit less gain depending on what you're doing in the particular microphone and preamplifier that you're working with. And it can color things. So you might get more bass response or you might get less bass response. And in fact, there are some pieces of gear today. So for example, the Universal Audio Apollo series of audio interfaces actually have a feature where they can change the input impedance on the microphone inputs. And they do that intentionally so that they can mimic some of the vintage gear that they have plugins for. So if you have a unison preamp of some sort for your Apollo, and you're trying to mimic, say for example, a Universal Audio 610 microphone preamplifier, then it actually matches the input impedance on your Apollo so that they can do a very good mimic, in essence, of that original analog gear. And same thing for a Vox box or any other type of vintage or vintage style. Actually, Vox box I don't think is actually that old, but any of those types of analog preamplifiers, they can match the impedance of the actual analog gear, and then they have software processing on their digital signal processors that do the rest of the work to, in essence, to mimic those preamplifiers. So they can intentionally create the coloration that those analog gears may impart. But let's get a practical example here. We have a microphone here for Danny. It is the Sennheiser MKH 50, which we just reviewed over on the main channel. And what I'm going to do is I have her microphone, the MKH 50, routed into a Universal Audio 6176. It's an analog preamplifier and compressor. And what I want to do, let me just bypass the compressor altogether, so it's not going to be doing any compression. The interesting thing about the 6176 is you can change the input impedance, and it has two settings basically for microphones. 2000 ohms, which is pretty typical for modern preamplifier designs, and then you can also switch it down to 500 ohms as well. So let's get a sample of Danny talking. Do you have something you can talk about, by the way? We didn't really prepare that, did we? Do you want to read a Sherlock Holmes quote? We happen to have some right here. Would you prefer one from The Barrel Coronet or from A Study in Scarlet? Surprise you. Okay, here we go. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone, and then I'm going to unmute Danny's microphone. And first we're going to get our levels set. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, actually, let's switch back to the main camera if you would. So I am going to hold up my finger when we are at 2000 ohms impedance. And then I'm going to move my finger like this when we're at 500 ohms, so you can hear the difference. Okay, so this is 2000 ohms, 500 ohms. All right.
Okay, are we ready?
Not quite yet. Stand by. All right, here we go.
It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Okay, so there was one sample. I noticed a very distinct difference in level. In fact, when we went to 500 ohms, the signal was a little bit stronger. The color was pretty similar. It wasn't a huge difference, but there might be a little bit more bass. I'm not 100% sure on that, but we can try on my voice as well. So that was one example, one simple example. Let's do this. Let's bring a microphone out here. This is a Sennheiser MKH 8050. And I'm going to turn the phantom power off. And I'm going to disconnect the cable from Danny's mic here. Give me just a second. Okay. And we'll plug that into this microphone. And okay, there we go. Then I'll turn on the phantom power. It's muted right now, so you shouldn't hear this. No, everything's still on. Okay. All right, I'm going to switch over to this microphone with the switchable impedance. So here we go. Okay, you're hearing me now on the Sennheiser MKH 8050. And right now we're at 2000 ohms for the input impedance. And I'm going to go ahead and switch it to 500 ohms now. Whoa, we're now at 500 ohms. One moment. We need to gain down. Okay, now we're gained down. We might need to gain down even more. So this is now at 500 ohms impedance on the MKH 8050 coming into the Universal Audio 6176. So it definitely changes the levels. I don't know if you're hearing a difference in terms of bass response. You are? Okay. So right now we're at 500 ohms. Now I'm going to switch. We're now at 2000 ohms. We dropped levels, so I'm compensating with some additional gain here. So I had to boost the gain by about plus 5 dB plus a little bit more on the output level. Now we're at 2000 ohms. So this microphone is designed to be used with an input impedance on the preamplifier of at least 1000 ohms, excuse me. So, and we'll take a look at its specifications here in just a minute. So there's another example of using an impedance mismatch with a particular microphone, just so you can hear what that sounds like. Now, the mismatch doesn't mean, again, generally you're not going to damage the microphone. It just may affect the overall quality of the signal, the level of the signal, and perhaps the coloration as well. So some things to consider there. Okay, let's go ahead and I'm going to switch back to my regular mic and let's go ahead and go to the chat and see if we have any questions that we need to address. Okay, back on my regular mic here. And okay, sounds like more bass on the 500 ohms. Yes, indeed. And that's a pretty common type of thing that you'll see. And I think in part, one of the reasons why, especially in the music world, you'll find that a lot of people like the vintage gear because they claim, oh, it has a warmer sound to it. Maybe that's part of it. And a lot of times the vintage gear will have lower input impedances than the more modern gear. Okay.
Okay, this is a joke.
Who cares about specifications? Just buy anything. Well, it depends. I appreciate that, Matt. The specifications, I would say this, I do want to underscore this. When it comes to specifications, there's no way in my mind to simply look at the specifications, say, for example, for two microphones, and be able to make a really good choice between which microphone is going to work best for your situation. Here's the, I was wondering what was in the background there. It's our Sherlock Holmes script. Anyway, so yeah, we'll actually dig into that a little bit more. Are there any other questions out there before we move on? Good. I appreciate that, Matt. That's actually interesting then, and we'll cover that in more detail. Michael, thank you so much for the super chat, and thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you here. And whoa, how big is that fish you just caught there? That looks enormous.
It's not good inches. It's a nice size fish.
Very good. Shoji, question, why are high impedance headphones higher quality, better sounding than low impedance headphones? First of all, I'd be careful about that. I don't think that's universally the case, but I think, and I don't know, for headphones, I haven't dug into headphones quite as much, but generally, when you have higher impedance, you have to push, in essence, more power, more current through the circuit, and for whatever reason, the higher impedance headphones are designed to require more current, generally more current to drive them to get the same audio levels. And that there are all sorts of engineering trade-offs that they're making. And in some cases, they can make a better sounding headphone that way. I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but that's one thought there. Here, Mike says it's all to do with loading. Probably Curtis will cover that. It's just a different kind of circuit design, in short. I don't know all of the ins and outs of that, to be honest. But again, they're just loading it differently. And it can change the character of the sound overall. So when you're creating any sort of transducer, and a transducer is anything that takes actual audio waves and converts them into an electrical signal, or the inverse of that, they take an electrical signal and convert it into sound waves. So that's going to be any microphone, any speakers, any headphones. It could also be pickups on instruments. Those are all transducers. But transducer design, there's so many little nuances to transducer design, and they can change the way that things sound based on how they engineer the particular circuit behind it. So there's a lot of nuance that, frankly, I don't understand entirely. So, producer Benford, Curtis, my NT5 just quit on me. I grabbed a 416, but I've been on the fence. I shoot YouTube tutorials in my pro production mass studio. I think the MKH 50 could work, but I move while solo shooting. Any thoughts? And it's a super chat. Thank you so much for the super chat. I would probably go with the 50. I think that's going to give you a little bit more latitude because, and especially indoors with a shotgun microphone with an interference tube design, when you get off axis, you're at risk of getting a really odd sort of warbling kind of effect that you can't really clean up in post. It's kind of fundamental to the audio. So I would definitely go with the 50 if you're going to be indoors, and especially if you have a tendency to move a little bit. So that's my recommendation there. And best wishes. I hope that works out for you. Sennheiser sounded better with its higher impedance load. Yeah, I think, Mike, that's a great point, and I think it reflects what Sennheiser intended. So the entire design of the Sennheiser microphone, the 8050, was designed for working with a preamp with an input impedance or a load impedance of 1,000 ohms or higher. And actually, I think in the specs, we'll take a look at the specs in just a minute here, and you'll see that reflected. Thank you. You bet. Thanks for the question. Danny says, high impedance headphones use thinner wires on the electromagnets, which requires more turns and creates a more powerful magnetic field that some say results in audibly superior transients. Thank you, Danny. Good input here. Audio buff. In Pro Audio, we focus more on the impedance of the speakers, 4, 8, and 16 ohms. The closer we get to 0 ohms, a direct short, the more power the amp will produce. Very good. So that's good information. In fact, by the way, if everything works out well, and I think it will, Audio Buff will be joining us next week on the live stream here to talk about his experience as the production engineer mixer for a state inauguration ceremony. So make sure you come, get yourself scheduled up for next week, same time, same place. We'll be excited to have Audio Buff come join us and tell us about his experience running that show. All right, Danny. The downside of high impedance headphones is they require more amplification and thus more demands on batteries in mobile production. That is, if the headphone amp is sufficient. Very good. Thank you, Danny. Edwin, this may be off topic, but in a future episode, will you discuss stream decks and if they help with recording, like voiceover or fixing audio problems or help streamline work? Yes, I can talk about that. I do have a stream deck for work, although I have to confess, I almost never use it. It's a pretty personal kind of thing. Some people love them. I think they definitely have their place. I didn't find it fit really well because I'd been so used to working without one for so long. But I think there's definitely some value to them. So that's a good idea. Thank you for that, Edwin. Alejandro, since the Sennheiser 816 has been discontinued for many years, what took its place? I think there's the MKH 8070, I believe. Not 100% sure on that, but I think there is an 8070, which is a long shotgun microphone. The 816, for reference, was a long shotgun microphone. So much more focused polar pattern, useful in situations where you're not right up next to the sound source, farther away from it, in other words.
Here's one from the very beginning.
Shoji, just watched the MKH 50 video. Thanks. What are the technical differences between the MKH 50 and 8050 designs? Which one do you prefer for indoor interview dialogue? Well, let me answer the last one first, and then when we get to the specs, we'll start to see some differences. But for indoor dialogue, at work we use the 50, and here in my studio, we use the 8050, and they're both fantastic. I don't have a clear preference. I just recently bought the 50. I've had the 8050 for years now. Bought the 50 recently so we could do a comparison and create today's video on the main channel. And in terms of sound, there's very little difference from my point of view. I think there may be a little tiny difference in terms of self-noise, with the 8050 being a little bit quieter. The 8050 is a modular design, so it does not come with a high-pass filter or a minus 10 dB pad, whereas the 50 has what they call a roll-off filter, which is like a very, very, very gentle high-pass filter or low-cut filter. And it also has a minus 10 dB pad built into it, so you don't have to buy those separately. The 50 is $1,200. The 8050 is $1,300. You can add, there is a module to add a pad and roll-off filter to the 8050. It costs an additional $470. So those are the differences. And when we look at the specs, you'll see some additional differences as well. All right. Thank you, Edwin. Appreciate the suggestion.
Okay, this is 2 parts.
2 parts. From Peter Locke, I ordered a Sennheiser MKH 8050 on Black Friday. When my Canadian retailer tried to order it from Sennheiser, they were told that it was no longer being manufactured due to supply chain challenges. Ooh, well, that's going to make a difference. I hope that they will be able to pick up manufacturing of that again. I did, when we made the video and I put some links into the 8050, there were some available in stock at the time I made the link. Hopefully that's still the case, but it sounds like they may have put manufacturing on hold. I don't know if that means forever, not planning to manufacture it again, or just until the supply chain challenges resolve themselves.
Might be the markets, like where you're ordering it from.
Yeah, it could be a particular market too. So in terms of their availability, maybe that, I don't know. Thank you for the input, Peter. It's good to get those those details. I always hear you talking about shotgun mics having issues with indoor recording. I own the Deity S Mic 2. Does owning an S Mic 2S help to deal with those issues, or I need to get something different? Jonathan, it's actually not, I'm just saying there's a risk. It's not an issue to use a shotgun microphone indoors. You can do it, and plenty of professionals do it. I think where the risk comes is that, again, if the sound source is off axis, at just the right place, just off to the, not talking right into the front of the microphone, but just off a little bit, because of the interference tube design. And let me grab a shotgun microphone to illustrate this. Here we're going to pull out the Sennheiser MKH 416, and this is it right here. You can see this is the interference tube, this long tube with slits in it. And that tube is actually made to help, it's called a phase interference tube. And basically what happens is that the sound coming from the sides should come in, and actually because of the laws of physics, and this is, again, I'm not going to go into all the details here, but it actually can capture those from the side and use that to eliminate those from the audio signal. So, or at least reduce it from the audio signal. So the idea is that that's actually used to make the microphone more directional. Well, the trick is when you get off axis just a little bit and the sound is coming into the side and into the front at the same time, just at the right angle, you start to get this sort of warbling sound. And that's the risk with using, it's especially prominent indoors, has been my experience. I've never really experienced it outdoors, but indoors is where it's been a little bit more of a problem. I think that's because of reverb. If the same sound, say I'm talking, and that sound bounces off of a surface and comes back into the side of the microphone, I think that's part of it. But in any case, that's where a shotgun microphone can just introduce a little bit more risk in terms of capturing a signal like you want to capture it. So it's not, there's no rule. There are no microphone police that are going to show up and say you cannot, we're giving you a citation because you're using a shotgun microphone indoors. That will never happen. However, I have noticed that sometimes does happen indoors. So will the S-Mic2S change that? I wouldn't necessarily recommend the S-Mic2S. It's got quite a substantial noise floor, and I found a lot of people are pretty disappointed with that. I'd stick with your S-Mic2, personally. If you're not having that issue, stick with it and just keep recording and making great sound. Mark, for preamps that have no variable impedance, is there any downside to using mics such as the MKH 50 with say a mixed pre? Let's look at the specs. I think that's a good time to transition over and look at some specifications. We'll come back to questions in just a bit, but let's switch over to the Mac here. And let me just show you some specifications. So for today, for example, I'm talking into an Earthworks Ethos microphone, which is connected to the Rupert Neve Design Shelford Channel. And this is the specification page for that particular piece of gear. I'm going to make the text a little larger here so we can see it. Input impedance, 2200 ohms. Incidentally, let's go to Earthworks Audio and look at their products here. And I'm going to go to the speech podcasting microphones, Ethos. And I'm going to make that a little smaller. That was a little, getting a little too close here. Where are our specifications? Apologies for all of the movement here. Okay, here we are in specifications. Output impedance is 65 ohms. And they actually have another specification here, which you might ask, well, what is this? What they're saying is that the minimum load impedance, I believe this is what this is. I could be wrong on this, so correct me if I'm wrong, someone out there. But I believe, and again, maybe none of us know because they're not very clear, but this is probably the minimum impedance they're expecting the preamplifier to have to use with this microphone. And that would actually match. It's close to a bridging impedance. So 65 ohms times 10 would be 650. 600 ohms, as they're saying, is the minimum load impedance. So anyway, there's one specification. So we have 2,200 ohms on the input on the Shelford channel, and we're outputting, where did it go? Oh, here it is, 65 ohms on the Earthworks Ethos. So we have definitely created a bridging impedance situation, and the microphone is working pretty much as it was designed to. So there's one example. Let's pop over to some others here. Let's look at the Zoom F3 specifications. So its input impedance is 3,000 ohms. You can see right there. I can make that a little bigger perhaps. Whoa, when I make it bigger, it wants to move. There it goes. Input impedance, 3,000 ohms. That's the K, of course, is 1,000. All right, so that's pretty much what we'd expect. Now, here's an interesting one. This is the Sound Devices MIX-PRE3 specifications here that we're looking at. It's a little unclear here, but I'm pretty sure this spec right here, let me just, again, make that bigger. Biggie size it for us. Okay, the inputs, mic, XLR active balanced 4K input. I'm pretty sure that this means that we're talking about a 4,000 ohm input impedance, but they're not 100% clear on that. So in any case, that's one example where you have to kind of, and if you're really curious, you might call the manufacturer and say, I just want to confirm, it looks like the specs, it says 4K input. Does that mean 4,000 ohms? Pretty sure that would be the answer, but something worth checking. So let's answer your question, Mark. I think you were asking about the MKH50 here. So on the MKH50, it's, and sometimes they call it nominal impedance as well, by the way, but its output impedance is 150 ohms. If you're using a Sound Devices MIX-PRE, and indeed they are 4,000 ohm inputs, which I believe they are, then 150 times 10 would be 1,500, and so you're definitely within that spec there. So you'd be much more than 10 times, or a fair bit more than 10 times, so you should be creating a very clear bridging impedance there. So that should work just great, as the manufacturer intended. And in fact, our entire review of the MKH50 was recorded with the 50 and Sound Devices MIX-PRE3, so you can hear what that sounds like there. Okay, let's look at the 8050 now. To go back to Shoji's question, so I wanted to know what are the technical differences between them. Let's just compare some of these specifications here and see if there are differences. First of all, sensitivity. I usually end up looking at this spec here, minus 34 dBV. I'm going to make that a little bigger. And scroll back down, minus 34 dBV. That's the sensitivity. It's going to refer in part to its output signal strength. And they specify this one a little bit differently. Let me make that bigger as well. Okay, so 25 millivolts per Pascal. Let's go back to the 8050. And that's going to be 20 millivolts per Pascal. So they're not exactly the same. What about the nominal impedance? So on the 8050, we're looking at 25 ohms. On the MKH50, it's 150 ohms. So what that tells me right now, Shoji, is that the circuit design is not exactly the same. It's slightly different. Just some other things that we might look at. So you can see here, this is what it's expecting the input impedance to be, at least 1,000 ohms. That's for the 50. Same for the 8050, it turns out. So that's the same. Let's see here. Current consumption on the 8050, it consumes 3.3 milliamps, whereas the 50 consumes 2 milliamps. So clearly the design, the electronic design is different between the two microphones. That being said, they sound very, very similar, and I think that what Sennheiser did is that they did a lot of engineering to get these sounding similar to each other. Here's the equivalent noise for the 50. I don't know if that's A-weighted. They're not very clear on that. Here's the CCIR spec for noise, but I think this is probably A-weighted. If I had to guess, let's see if they're the same. 8050, they're saying is 13 dB A-weighted. Equivalent noise level as per CCIR is 22 on the 8050 and 21 on the 50. So they're very, very close in terms of their self-noise specification. The 50 can run on 48 volts of phantom power, but the 8050, same, actually, 48 volts. So they're the same there. They both require the full 48 volts. So there's just a way to compare those, but just comparing these specifications, I couldn't really say, oh, you know what, I think that the 50 or the 8050 is going to be better for me. There's just no real way to tell that. I think that it's not that clear, but in any case, understanding the impedance, I think, is important there because you can make sure. There are mixers out there that have input impedances that are only around 1,000 or 1,100, 1,200 ohm input impedance. So if you're using a microphone that has a 200 ohm output impedance, you wouldn't necessarily be achieving a full bridging impedance bridge. So it may not perform optimally. It may not get the sound that you're expecting in those cases. So that's the reason it's important. I will say that almost all field recorders and mixers, anything produced in the last 5 years, certainly, almost always, in my experience, has an input impedance of at least 2,000 ohms. And we saw that earlier here when we were looking at the F3 has a 3,000 ohm input, Mix Pre has a 4,000 ohm input. So just some things there. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. This is the Earthworks SV33. This is a studio microphone. Look at this. It has an output impedance of 600 ohms, which is interesting. Also, this is interesting, and I want to show you kind of one spec that's, again, kind of interesting. The phantom power specification for 48 volts is that it should also be able to, that input should also supply, that power supply should supply 10 milliamps of current. Okay, so there's voltage and current. But what's interesting, if you come over here to the Zoom F3, if you look at the phantom power specification, it can supply 24 or 48 volts. However, it can only provide a combined channel total of 10 milliamps or less. And now the spec is actually that each input is supposed to be able to provide 10 milliamps. But on the Zoom F3, between the two inputs, it can only supply a total of 10 milliamps. So you have to be careful on your microphones. If I were to choose, say I was going to do a really high-end podcast, I was going to spend $2,000 per microphone. If this, actually, I don't think this microphone is actually available anymore. I think they discontinued it. But each of those microphones draws 10 milliamps. So the Zoom F3 would not be able to provide enough power for two of these microphones. It could only support one of them. And even so, I would never want to run that close to the spec if I could avoid it. So probably this would be a microphone, the SV33, that you probably would not want to run into your Zoom F3 as an example. So just a kind of a quick look over specifications and what they mean in practical terms. Okay, with that, let's go back to the chat and see what kind of questions we have going out there. Hopefully I haven't created confusion. I've hopefully illuminated, provided some input that makes things easier for you going forward. Kenny asks, how is the handling noise between the 50 and the 8050? The 50 did really, really well in terms of handling noise with its supplied shock mount. I have found that the 8050 also works very nicely with a quality shock mount. I have never really run into, actually that's not entirely true. Some lower quality shock mounts I have picked up some handling noise with the 8050, but I stopped using those and used a better shock mount. So I think they're about the same, in short, has been my experience. Shoji, thanks for the deep dive into the 50-8050 spec differences. The 50 seems to be the industry standard for dialogue, but the 8050 is an interesting alternative. I think Sennheiser was certainly hoping that the 8050 would be an interesting alternative. I will say this, the difference in size between the two microphones is stark. In fact, let's just show that here. If you could pop that out of the, it just pops right out of each of the front and the back. We're going to get our microphones here for comparison. Okay, so here's the 50. Here's the 8050 for comparison. So there's a pretty big difference in size and weight. So that's definitely something that Sennheiser was going for, is making something smaller that would be easier to boom at the end of a boom pole all day long. If you're putting them on a static boom, doesn't make a difference probably. But if you are doing what is called ceiling surfing, when you're operating a boom mic on a relatively low ceiling and you're having to put the mic right near the ceiling, you're going to get several additional centimeters or inches there between the two. It's almost like twice the length.
Just have a little gap between.
A gap between them. Okay, there's a gap between them. So there's a pretty big difference there that's outside of the specs. Differences between the MKH 50 and the 40. The 40 is a cardioid, if I'm not mistaken. I have not used the 40, so I don't know a lot about the difference there. So the capsule is probably different, of course. But I haven't used the 40, so I'm not sure. Sorry about that. Camille, you are the lucky owner of the DPA 4017B. What does this microphone have that the industry standard Schoeps CMIT5U does not? And what is your opinion about the MKH 8060? Oh, well, you're asking a couple of questions that I can't necessarily answer, but let's take a look at the Schoeps. Give me just a minute to pull that up here. Schoeps microphones. Okay. All right, let's go over to the Schoeps. All right, so we have the Colette microphones. We have the, and this is specifically the MK41 supercardioid. All right, so.
CMIT5.
What's that?
CMIT5U.
Oh, yeah, we're also going to look at the CMIT5U, but let's look at this one first. So we're looking at the 41.
Well, it has a pattern right on it.
Yeah, the pattern is indicated right there. Technical specifications. Okay, actually, so I want to compare this one first. We'll come back to your question, Camille, I promise. Let's see here. Supercardioid gives you the sensitivity, noise level, in two different specs. So here's A-weighted and here's the CCIR. A-weighted signal to noise, maximum sound pressure. We'll come to there's the mini CMIT there, but it doesn't give the impedance, which is really interesting. I would have expected, and then they used to have the impedance on the site here. Here's one thing, certainly with one of the reasons to use a microphone like this, like the Schoeps or the 50 or the MKH 8050, is that their off-axis coloration seems to be really, really well controlled relative to shotgun microphones. And we'll take a look at that in just a minute here. Let's see, maybe this will give us something. You saw the impedance somewhere?
Doesn't, no, not really.
Not really. This is also a modular system, so you can add a low cut or high pass filter as well as a module, like a physical module. Okay, anyway, let's go back here and let's go take a look at the microphones. Product. Let's go to the shotgun microphones, and we're going to the CMIT series, and we'll go to the CMIT 5. Schoeps tends to, I think the biggest thing in my experience, Camille, is that Schoeps seems to voice their microphones differently. Schoeps seems to have as a philosophy to reproduce sound as close to reality as possible. They're trying to get a really, this is my sense, I don't know. I don't have inside information. But the sense I get is that they're really trying to reproduce sound as accurately as possible. Whereas I think Sennheiser, as a primary design principle, is aiming for something that sounds great, which is not necessarily the same thing. So I think that's where you're going to hear a difference between the MKH 416 or the 8060, which is their more modern shotgun microphone, versus the 416, which is their more vintage microphone. It's funny to think of that. We're calling it vintage. It was made in the 1970s. So I'm older than that microphone. But I think that's the main philosophical difference I see between the design of the microphones from Schoeps versus Sennheiser. The Sennheisers generally will sound warmer directly into the recorder. So if you're live streaming and you want a warmer sound, I think typically the Sennheiser is going to provide a little bit more of that. Schoeps is going to be a little bit more real life, to be honest. So not so broadcasty sounding. And it also, part of what it comes down to is that it depends on your voice and how it mixes with the microphone. In our video today over on the main channel where we compared the Sennheiser MKH 50 to the 8050 and the Schoeps CMIT, sorry, not CMIT, but the CMC 641, the Colette with the 41 capsule. On my voice, it actually emphasizes a weird nasally character of my voice, which I don't love. It can be EQ'd and it can sound fine in post, but if you're using it for live sound, that's where it could become a little bit of a problem, unless you're also applying EQ there. So just different philosophies in terms of design is what it comes down to. Hopefully that makes sense. Danny, due to supply chain issues, Sennheiser suspended accepting orders for a time. The 8050 is not discontinued. I recently purchased an 8050 and an 8060 from B&H, along with Rycote nano shields for each. Okay, good. Thanks for the additional info on that, Danny. Very much appreciate that. Hey, Carlos, thank you so much for the super chat. It's great to see you here. Thanks for joining us. And Camille, thanks for the 2 Chardonnay and Brie. Very much appreciate that. Thank you so much for the support there. What's after a Rupert Neve design Shelford Channel? What do you mean? What's an upgrade from there? I have no need for anything more, certainly. I mean, this also, I bought it before the price went way up. The price has gone up pretty substantially.
It doesn't need any encouragement.
Danny says that I don't need any encouragement. Thank you very much, Renee. So I don't have any plans for anything beyond that. And I don't know, I don't really even see the Shelford channel as like the ultimate vocal processing channel. I think it's a really good one. Is it the right one for every situation? No. Is it the right one? Should everyone aspire to have a Rupert Neve design Shelford channel? No. It's just something that works really well for our live streams, and it's what we use.
Okay, here's 2. It has 2.
All right, 2-part here from Gert. If you compare the frequency response graphs for the 50 and the 8050, you'll see that the older 50 has a treble bump. Perhaps older mics were designed to counteract high frequency loss in analog media. I'm really glad you brought that up. Let's go ahead and take a look here and see. I don't know if we have to go to support to get that. So this is for the 8050 downloads. We're going to do English, brochure, instruction manual. Okay. We'll get this one right here. So this is for the 8050. Let's get our frequency response chart here. Apologies for the motion. Oh, this one may not have. Oh, here's the specifications. Here's the polar pattern chart, just to illustrate what that looks like. At different frequencies, it's directional in different ways. So you'll notice here, for example, at 3200 hertz, or 32 kilohertz, which is generally beyond the hearing of humans for the most part, it changes substantially here at the back. So that's probably not a big issue, again, because most of us aren't hearing that anyway. However, even notice here that at 16 kilohertz, it is less sensitive at the sides at 90 degrees versus down at 500 hertz. So that would produce some small amount of coloration here. So here's the response curve, the frequency response curve for the 8050. And in fact, trying to remember, but I think my 8050 came with the frequency response chart for that individual model. But let's just stick with this one here for now. Okay, so let's go and get the same thing for the 50. Here's the instruction manual. Go ahead and download that. All right, so here's for the 50. Again, apologies for the motion. This part's in German, but this will work for us. Here we go. Okay. So, wow, that looks like it was printed in 1962. Let's see if the one in English is any different.
You just skipped it.
I know, I just skipped it. Now I'm getting into the English portion, but it looks like it's the exact same diagrams. In any case, okay, so here's for the 50. There is a frequency bump between about 3,000 hertz and it comes down maybe to about 15,000 hertz. It's about a 2 dB boost. So there's definitely a little bit more of a boost in the high frequencies there. That happens incidentally to be through a good portion of the sibilance range. But yeah, I think there's a good chance that with analog media back in the day, before we all moved to digital recording, or most of us moved to digital recording, that they may have voiced the microphones to offset the character of tape recordings. So to add a little bit more high frequency, which tapes had a tendency not to be quite as sensitive to. So there is definitely something to that hypothesis. I think you're probably onto something there. Secondly, the 8050 is very susceptible to low frequency handling noise unless you have a good shock mount and use a healthy high pass filter setting. Good to know, Gert. I haven't run into that problem on a boom. I'm using some pretty nice Rycote shock mounts, so haven't had a lot of problems with that, but it's good to know. One thing to watch out for. Audio buds. Something else to blow the mind is with mics and speakers, the impedance changes with the frequency. It's a good point. I was trying to keep it simple, but you're right. It does change with frequency. And with mics, the impedance curve is different between polar patterns. There is so much to learn. I completely agree, Audio Buff. There is a lot to learn, and the frequency, the impedance at different frequencies does differ. So, in fact, I think we saw that in one of the specs here. Let's just go back up. I can't remember if it was the 50 or maybe it was the Earthworks, or no, maybe it was the Shelford Channel. No, we didn't see, it wasn't so much in impedance, but there was a difference in maximum input at different frequencies. So up to 22 kilohertz, the Shelford Channel can handle a max input of plus 21 dBu, but only 8 dBu from 20 hertz to 22 kilohertz. So that's another example of how when you see a single number specification, a lot of times it's averaging things out. So there's a lot of averaging that goes on to be able to capture something in a single number. So that's an important factor to keep in mind as well. So thanks, Audio Buff. Okay. Thank you. That explains why my NT5 was ruined. I ran the NT5 and a cloud-lifted SM7B at a client's house, and the NT5 was never the same. The F3 couldn't supply the correct voltage. It actually, I think, is a different in current that it couldn't supply. Actually, maybe it couldn't do the voltage at that point as well. But and the SM7B was using phantom power because you were using a cloud lifter. Got it. So yeah, it was drawing too much, more than the F3 could handle. I don't know. Maybe it damaged the microphone. It sounds like maybe it did. So those things you do need to be careful with. And that's one of the limitations of the Zoom has a tendency to do things like that where, and again, not a bashing session. I have Zoom products. I love them. The F3 is one example where in an effort to make it so that it would be more power efficient and to keep the body really, really small, they figured, is my assumption, that, well, most microphones, incidentally, most microphones don't require more than 5 milliamps. But in cases where they do, that's where you could run into this problem. And I don't know what the NT5 requires. We can take a look at that, in fact. We have more questions? Yeah. Okay, give me just a second here. I am just curious here. Microphones. Let's do... this would be more of a studio. Okay. NT5. And a lot of times these companies will not specify what kind of current they require. See here, for example, power requirements only says 24 volt. Oops, let me make that bigger. P24 and P48, that's all it says. Doesn't tell you how much current it draws. So you don't know. So that's one thing to keep in mind. That's why it's tricky when you're working with something like a Zoom F3 and you want to go check the specs on your microphone to make sure that it can supply enough. You may not get the specs in the written form. You may have to contact the support organization to understand it. So, Matt Ruff, if you can afford several Earthworks mic, you should not be using a Zoom recorder to begin with. It's like putting a regular unleaded gas in a supercar. It needs premium. Fair point, Matt. I just wanted to give a practical example. But yes, you're right. But we also just had a very practical example, an NT5 and an SM7B. Those are not like Those aren't supercars, and yet the F3 couldn't supply enough for both of those. Sounds like with a cloud lifter. So, but you're right. Nevertheless, you answered both my burning questions in the same live stream. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much, and thanks for asking the questions. We have a few more minutes here. Danny is scouring the chat as best she can. My chair's getting squeaky as it gets a little older. I don't know if you've all noticed that.
Wow, there's a lot
of conversation going on. That's good.
Yeah.
I like the conversation. What other things can I talk about? Well, here we go. Mark, not to cause mic whiplash, but how does the MKH 50 compare to the AT 4053B? I actually have, I don't have an older microphone comparison on that. I think I found the MKH 50 to sound better. What you can do, Mark, is you can pull up, I have an older video where we talk about the AT 4053B, and you can pull it up in a separate tab from the MKH 50 video, and you can play them back and forth so you can hear the difference between them. You can also, of course, now with the newfound knowledge that you have as of today, you can also compare their specifications to see if there's anything of import there for the particular kit that you're using. Do you have, what's the output impedance of each of those microphones? How does that compare to the input impedance you have on your mix pre? You're probably going to be fine with any of them, to be honest, with a mix pre. So another thing that you'll see, a big part of the reason why, for example, the Zoom recorders, the F-series recorders, are less expensive than the mix pre is that they will also do things like the headphone amplifiers in the Zoom recorders are not as, they can't supply as much output. So you can drive high impedance headphones, and this is not a set of high impedance headphones. I was just holding up to demonstrate headphones, but high impedance headphones by 250 ohms with a mix pre without a problem. With a Zoom F-series recorder, probably not. You will not get enough volume to really make it realistic. So that's another example of where Zoom is, I think, again, they're a consumer electronics company aiming for, a specific set of situations, where you're going to be using lower impedance headphones, and they think that's fine. And it is fine if that's what you're doing. Okay.
We need to go back to Camille's question and go to the DPA.
Oh, the DPA, indeed. Okay. What does this microphone have? The industry standard Schoeps CMIT5U does not. And what is your opinion about the 8060? So I've never used the 8060, so I don't know, but that's the corresponding shotgun in the same 8000 series. So I think it uses the same preamplifier, but it uses a longer interference tube capsule module. What does the DPA 4017B have that is CMIT5U does not? Well, I believe it's smaller, first of all. It's also a modular design where you can use different preamplifiers. There's an A, a B, and a C preamplifier for the DPA, which have slightly different characteristics. We can look at their other, let's see if they give us we're going to take a look. So here is the Schoeps CMIT5U polar pattern as an example. And let's go to the DPA microphones. And let's look at I think it's going to be under pencil. Let's do a search. 4017B. Shotgun microphone, here it is, okay. So you can see the different preamplifier modules. There is I believe this is the C, I think that's the A, and this is the B, I believe. I'm not 100% on that. I have the B right here. Let's take a look at the specifications. Where are they?
Go back down.
Explore the specs. Okay, here we go. All right, so here's the B. This also has the low cut and the high boost on it, which is the one that I use typically. Here is what the frequency response looks like generally. Do they have the polar pattern? Here's the polar pattern. Okay, you'll notice once you get to 16 kilohertz that Here's an example of how a shotgun microphone tends to be quite a bit more colored than a non-shotgun microphone. So the MKH 50 and the 8050 and the Schoeps CMC641 non-shotgun microphones tend to be a little bit more even in their frequency response off-axis. But a shotgun microphone, and this is actually pretty good for a shotgun microphone, believe it or not. If we go back to the Schoeps, look at how it differs over here when you get up to 4 kilohertz, 16 kilohertz, you can see it gets very, very different in terms of its overall shape. This one looks highly average to me. This one looks a little bit close. This one probably has some averaging going on too, but
I mean, why it's
why it's a spiky thing instead of on the Schoeps. It looks, I don't know, maybe it's different, maybe it's not. But that's one thing that goes into the high end. The higher end microphones, they actually put a lot of engineering, especially, for example, here when they're working on a shotgun microphone, making the off-axis coloration as small as possible is one of the big things. Then they have to put a lot of engineering in that to get that right. And actually, this is considered fairly, believe it or not, this is fairly even for a shotgun microphone. That's another reason not to use a shotgun microphone. If you want the off-axis sounds to sound more natural, then you probably don't want to use a shotgun microphone. So it just depends on what your recording goals are, I guess. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Camille. I've apologized on the 4060. I'm just not familiar with that one. I haven't used that one yet.
You mean the 8060?
Sorry, the 8060. All right, Shoji, thanks for the observations on the 8050 versus the 50. Smaller size, different frequency response, etc. You got it.
Okay, we're at time.
We're at time. Danny says it's time. Thank you, everybody, for coming to our sound for video session today. Hope that was helpful for you. Again, I would definitely recommend you come next week. We're going to talk about what it's like to be the mixer for a very big event, like the inauguration of a governor here in the United States at one of the states here. What the requirements look like, all the things you have to do, how you make it work successfully. Can't wait to talk to Audio Buff on that one next week. So make sure you come on back for that. In the meantime, get out there, make some great sound, and we'll talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.